Yukina, my sweet love. That's twice now that we've had to go to our separate worlds. But I know someday we'll be together for good. Until then, I'll try and be a better man.
Spirit gun!
So I'm gonna start by saying something that most people probably won't agree with me on, but I actually like remakes and adaptations. And that goes for everything. Video games, movies, music, and yes, even anime. While I do agree that we're still being oversaturated with them at the moment, and most of the companies who have jumped on the remake/live action adaptation bandwagon are probably at a low point creatively, I still think there's value to be had in modernizing stories that we deem classics to be more relatable, or in taking in someone else's reinterpretation so you can get a fresh and alternative perspective. I'm not of the belief that that takes away from the original work either, unless the message is specifically about enjoying things for what they are, or not living in the past, or something else along those lines. What I really tend to dislike is when a remake is created without giving respect to its origins. You know, when it's obvious something is only being remade because it's guaranteed profit. And you can tell they were trying to pander to passionate fans, but also trying to make things simple enough for a new audience to digest, and as a result, it comes out an unfocused mess. Now, having said all that, can you guess what happened to the live-action adaptation of my all-time favorite anime series, Yu Hakusho? They butchered it. So for those who don't know what Yu Hakusho is, it's a manga from the 90s about a delinquent boy named Yusuke who loses his life when he protects a child from being hit by a reckless driver. However, Yusuke gets a second chance at life by the ruler of the spirit world, Koenma, because his selfless act meant that he died before he was expected to. The only catch is he now has to become a spirit detective, which is someone who protects Earth from demons and other supernatural things. It's a fun story written by Yoshihiro Togashi, the same guy who made international news for marrying Usagi from Sailor Moon. It's a popular one too. That's why I wasn't too shocked when I learned Netflix was working on a live-action version of the anime all the way back in 2020. By this point, they already had a pretty poor reputation when it came to adaptations that were released on their platform, including the ones that they didn't even have a direct hand in producing. But, I mean, it's Yu Hakusho. I could play cool and pretend that I knew this was gonna be a steaming pile of shit from the start, but I'll fully admit that I was the exact type of nostalgia-blinded fanboy that these adaptations are made for. I did temper my expectations, but I'd be a huge liar if I said there wasn't a huge part of me that wanted to see a live-action Yu Hakusho. I still should have been more cautious though, because after watching this series for the first time, I was disappointed. I was more than disappointed. I'm telling you, as a fan who really went into this show looking for something new to appreciate, this show doesn't do Togashi's work any justice. And I'll admit that I can be an apologist for a lot of dog shit. I'm in the small minority of people who enjoys watching GT more than Super, but I really can't excuse this one. I love the source material too much to say that I'm a fan of what they did with it. And I'm just gonna start with the show's biggest flaw, because everything wrong with this show can be traced back to the pacing. So the original series is split up into 4 major sagas, but we'll only talk about the first 2 since that's what the live action adapts. First, there's the Spirit Detective Saga, which is when Yusuke becomes a spirit detective. This saga is a bit less action-heavy and focuses more on establishing most of the show's main cast and their relationships with each other. And then there's the Dark Tournament Saga. This is when our gang is forced by a roided-up demon named Toguro to participate in a tournament against other demons if they want to keep their lives. Altogether, the Spirit Detective and Dark Tournament sagas make up a total of 66 episodes. The live action is composed of 5. I'm not saying it's impossible to condense that much story and come out with something decent, but they weren't able to prove that here. According to the show's director, Sho Tsukikawa, they initially planned to tell Yu Hakusho's story in the span of 3 seasons, but they weren't sure how long that would take, so they condensed the first 2 arcs into 5 episodes. I know that making a show takes time. You don't just write up a script and have an episode ready to ship by the end of the week. In fact, we know how long this show in particular took to make. 2 years of pre-production, 10 months of shooting, and 2 more years in post. Anything could have happened in that 5-year time span, so I can at least say I understand the crew's desire to tell the most recognizable and lauded part of the story, the Dark Tournament, in an abridged fashion. but I definitely don't agree with it at all. My favorite parts of Yu Yu Hakusho are the moments whenever Yusuke gets to actually be a detective. This is a battle shonen anime, so it has more than its fair share of fighting, but I was partial to the episodes where Yusuke and the gang got to use these supernatural tools and work together to figure out where this missing demon is gone, or why someone is acting out of character. And you get a lot of that right in the beginning of the story when Yusuke is still getting used to his new responsibility. These scenes work so well because they showed Yusuke, the delinquent type who everyone dismissed as a habitual troublemaker and potential dropout, was capable of thinking with more than his fists. Granted, these cases would be solved with his fists most of the time, but Yusuke's not an idiot. He just didn't operate well without a purpose, and despite his initial protest against playing the hero, he was really good at it. I think the live action starts off with Yusuke doing a good job playing the detective as well. On all of my rewatches of the show, I've always been more engaged with the first 2 episodes because that's before it turns into your more typical martial arts combat type of show. You know, Yusuke has his moments where he's walking around, talking to people, taking note of things, trailing suspects, doing things you would expect of a detective. And much like the anime, this is my favorite part of the show by far. But they let it go too soon because they really want the Dark Tournament part of the series to start as soon as possible. By condensing the first arc to just the first 2 episodes, they really screwed themselves out of some crucial character and world building. We barely get to see how vast the spirit and demon worlds are, and the importance of the people who come from them. Like, the show does have Yusuke spend a decent amount of time with his love interest Keiko and his rival Kuwabara, and I can buy the relationships and chemistry between these characters. They're fortunate enough to be gifted with screen time that establishes and develops who they are. But what about Kurama and Hiei, the 2 other main characters in the show that our cast should really be more familiar with before they go off to fight in the Dark Tournament? I mean, by the point the Dark Tournament starts in the original story, our characters have all met and fought and even went on a completely separate adventure together. They had a rapport with each other, even if it was a bit shaky. But because Yusuke barely talks to Kurama and Hiei in the story outside of a few scenes, when they all finally meet up together, our heroes all feel like allies of circumstance. You know, when they all unite and head off to that island to participate in the Dark Tournament together, I should be screaming at my screen in excitement like a man-child, instead of feeling like, oh, is it time for this part of the story already? I don't think anything pissed me off more in this show than the 3rd episode. Major Yu Yu Hakusho spoilers incoming, but in just 1 episode, we're properly introduced to Yusuke's mentor Genkai. Yusuke also gains Genkai's spirit energy through her spirit wave orb technique. Toguro kills Genkai, and this is also the episode when the gang finally unites. This is the episode that jaded me on the rest of the show. The biggest consequence of this show's pacing is that they're forced to treat these iconic and key character moments as spectacle. And it really does feel like everyone who produced this show didn't understand what made them so great in the first place. First of all, Genkai's death has no weight. None. When it happened in the original story, it hurt because she was a rock to Yusuke and Kuwabara. She was one of the first characters Yusuke and Kuwabara formed a bond with, and they were able to learn more about the dangers of what they were getting into as psychics because of her. Just as she beat and punished them, she also cared for them deeply and saw the potential in both of them. That's why she always let them fight their own battles, but never hesitated to put her life on the line for theirs if and when necessary. You can easily buy the relationship between Genkai and Yusuke in this story, which is why when Yusuke shoots that spirit gun up in the air in memory of her after, well, you know, you feel emotional. This mentor figure that we just spent most of the story with up to this point just lost her life in a mortal fight against this tragic figure from her past, and Yusuke was too late to save her, but she's able to pass on some parting words, and yeah man, it works. That's the benefit of giving your audience time to sit with these characters. Something the live action should have taken more note of, because in this version of the show, we spend 15 minutes with Genkai at her dojo, a 3-week time skip happens where she passes her power on to Yusuke, and then Toguro meets her later and just flexes. There's no emotional connection at all. Genkai doesn't even lift a finger, she's just off-screen. And speaking of Genkai passing on her power, let's talk about why that also fails. When Yusuke agreed to inherit Genkai's spirit energy in the anime, it was a decision that pained him. And I mean, it literally gave him the worst pain of his life. Not just because he was absorbing her power either, but he was gaining the experience and legacy of one of Earth's oldest and most powerful protectors. It's a literal passing of the torch scene where Yusuke physically shows his determination to not only defeat Toguro, but protect Earth and everyone he cares about. And personally, I think it's the most impactful scene in the entire story. Again, the Dark Tournament is great. I can see why they wanted to bring this part of the show to screen, but it's not worth rushing the story because you're not going to be able to do moments like this justice. When Genkai transfers her energy to Yusuke in the live action, he just stands there. He just stands there. I hate this scene, and not just because they made the artistic choice to not show Yusuke going through any physical pain, but because they also missed the lesson that came along with that. Yusuke doesn't announce a newfound resolve to protect Earth or carry on Genkai's legacy. Instead, Genkai just gives Yusuke her spirit energy after warning him not to sacrifice what he loves for strength, which is exactly what Toguro did. But even this bit of wisdom has little weight for Yusuke because he hasn't even met Toguro yet, so he doesn't even really understand just how destructive what Genkai is trying to warn him about can be. This scene would have worked a lot better if we could have gotten at least just one scene of Yusuke meeting Toguro and being humbled by him just as he was in the original. You know what could have fixed that? More time developing your characters instead of killing them off in 30 minutes. The biggest argument I've seen in this show's favor is that it stands on its own if you watch it without necessarily thinking of it as an adaptation. Like, if you never saw or heard of Yu Hakusho beforehand, then the story would be a nice little contained watch. But personally, I can't speak to what that experience must feel like because I know the source material all too well to just detach from it. Like, I can forgive the show for dumbing certain things down and cutting out others, like 90% of the Dark Tournament, and really not making it a tournament at all, because that's just far too much story to tell in 5 episodes, and not all of it is really important. But if you're asking me to accept a wholly inferior version of this story for what it is when we have this to compare it to, then I'm gonna be stubborn and refuse. That's not to say I came away from watching this show without anything to appreciate though. I did give this series an honest chance. I rewatched it like twice when it came out, and I've still gone back to revisit it a few more times. Like I said earlier, I liked how the relationships between both Yusuke and Keiko and Yusuke and Kuwabara were portrayed, and I was also fond of all the fight scenes. The choreo was fun and creative. It wasn't just punch this thing harder and harder until it finally gets knocked down. Yusuke was scrappy, and I think the show was always fun to watch whenever we got to see him and anyone else throwing hands. Also, I think this show has cool scenery sometimes, among many other cool visual effects. I also liked, well, that's about it. The list of things I dislike about this show far exceeds the things I think it did well. Also, I'm not the type of person to complain about casting choices or criticize an actor's appearance because I think they're ugly or anything. But I will throw dirt on the wardrobe and wigs in this show. I think they nailed Yusuke and Kuwabara's looks despite them omitting his pompadour, but am I alone in thinking everyone else here looks like they're in mediocre cosplay? And this is one of those things where you will have to suspend disbelief with live action anime adaptations a bit, because they're trying to translate cartoons to real life visually. But there's other live action adaptations with eccentric character designs that came off pretty well in my opinion. Better than they do in Yu Hakusho. I wouldn't even go this far, but if you wanted to, you could have a fair argument in saying the characters as portrayed in the Yu Hakusho stage play look better than the characters as portrayed in the live action because they make better attempts at remaining faithful to the original designs. I wouldn't agree with that though. Maybe just for Koima.
Earth the toddler bitch!
When it's all said and done, the Yu Hakusho live action is nothing more than one big disappointment. I still think they could have made something great here, as there are still things that you can come away from in the show and appreciate, even with only 5 episodes. But they tried to tell way too much story in too little time, and the show came out as an unfocused, rushed mess as a result. As I said way back at the beginning of this video, I'm not one of these dudes who believes that adaptations adaptations or remakes in general should never be attempted. But when you skip over all this character and emotional and worldly foundation, you're gonna collapse under the weight of all that spectacle eventually. Remember the Dark Tournament? Remember when Hiei summoned the Dragon of Darkness Flame? Remember when Togoro's muscles did that thing? Fuck you, why should I care about any of these characters or moments if you're not gonna give them the time that they deserve? Again, by the director's own admittance, they were too blinded by wanting to hit the show's greatest beats without putting in the work for any of it. There's very little emotional investment for you to care and tear up when Genkai meets Toguro again in the afterlife. And there's also very little knowledge that you have about these characters beforehand. So when Kurama transforms into his repressed silver hair Yoko Kurama form, you end up more confused and apathetic than excited. And I feel like that's a perfect way to describe this show as a fan of the series. I also feel like I'm talking in circles at this point though. This rant has been a few years in the making, and after doing all that talking, I'm over it now. I'm not gonna lose any sleep over this show. I'm not expecting or looking forward to a season 2 anytime soon. This show doesn't necessarily change how I feel about remakes or anything either. It just reinforces my belief that they shouldn't even be attempted if you're not gonna try to do anything interesting. Don't just half-ass a story because you want to cash in on someone else's nostalgia. Anyways, Spy Fiction video soon.